New York City, 1935. A metropolis built on steel and ambition, now haunted by something ancient, something feral. Forget the whispers of speakeasies and the glamour of Fifth Avenue. Beneath the manicured lawns of Central Park, a darkness stirs. It started with cattle, mutilated, drained. Then the disappearances. The police, confounded, called it a runaway lunatic, a vagrant's superstition. But the bite marks, they weren't human. They were too large, too powerful. The chilling echoes in the night were not laughter, they were howls. The city, blinded by its own sophistication, refused to look at the shadows. Only one man dared to look, a man who knows the human world is just a thin veil over the terror beneath. Detective Kane Bones. He's about to unearth New York's darkest secret, a secret with claws. The year is 1935. The Great Depression cast a long, suffocating shadow over New York, but a far deeper dread was settling over the city's heart. Kane Bones, a name whispered in the back alleys of police precincts and the hushed parlors of the elite, was not your typical investigator. A tall, gaunt figure, perpetually clad in a trench coat that seemed to absorb the city's gloom, Bones possessed a keen, almost unsettling intuition. He didn't just solve crimes, he solved the impossible ones, the ones that smelled of sulfur and fear. His office on a lower floor of an unassuming building in the financial district served as his gateway to the occult underbelly of the modern world. The echoes of 1935 are often the loudest, and the shadows that Detective Kane Bones faces extend throughout the modern city. If you dare to continue peeking behind the curtain of reality, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more chilling cases from the past. And now, I want to know where the silence is broken for you. Tell me in the comments below. From which city and country are you following this story? I'm really eager to know how far these chronicles of the paranormal detective are going. Keep listening, stay vigilant, and keep the lights on. Detective Kane Bones was in the midst of cataloging ancient Sumerian tablets, his personal, peculiar hobby, a distraction from the banal horrors of the everyday world, when the heavy mahogany door of his office, usually secured by two hefty deadbolts and a simple, subtle ward of protection, burst open with an alarming clatter. It was Captain Alistair Finch, age 52, a man whose face, usually a mask of weary big-city composure, was now etched with raw, visceral fear that seemed to steam off his youthful police uniform. Finch wasn't prone to dramatics. His presence here meant the official channels had completely broken down. Bones, the department, they're covering it up. The mayor wants to keep the park open, to maintain the facade of normalcy. They've issued a public statement claiming it's nothing more than a large rabid dog that somehow made its way in from the outskirts. Finch threw a thick, grease-stained manila folder onto Bones' meticulously organized desk, disturbing a stack of rare 17th-century texts on arcane zoology. The smell of cold Central Park mud and institutional disinfectant wafted off the papers. Inside were horrifying photographs, the brutalized livestock, cows and goats from a small private farm bordering the upper park, their bodies exhibiting strange, almost surgical mutilations, and the small blood-soaked square of earth where the Thorne couple had vanished. The scene of the disappearance was meticulously documented: the shredded fabric of a woman's evening dress, a man's broken spectacle lens, and, crucially, the aforementioned footprint. Bones donned a pair of thin leather gloves and carefully examined a plaster cast of the impression, running his thumb over the immense depth and the terrifying detail of the three distinct, unnatural toes. "A dog, Captain?" Bones' voice was low, a rumbling baritone that carried a weight of profound skepticism. "Perhaps a canine that weighs 600 pounds and walks upright after a night on the town." He traced the unnaturally long stride depicted in one of the accompanying police sketches. "The pattern isn't random. It hunts, but not for food. It hunts with a frightening, almost intelligent efficiency and malice. This exhibits a territorial display, a deep primal aggression coupled with what appears to be a deliberate effort to inflict terror. The beast, Bones deduced, was announcing its presence to the city. His immediate and most promising lead was a single frantic, barely legible letter attached to the last page of the file. It was from a retired park keeper, Mr. Wallace Wally Perkins, age 68, who claimed he saw a shadow as large as a bear, with eyes like embers, near the Bow Bridge before the first cattle mutilation. Perkins, it seemed, was the only eyewitness the police had immediately dismissed as a drunken vagrant, suffering from old age and too much solitude. The letter contained a vague, almost poetic warning about the iron that sleeps beneath the leaves. Bones decided to visit Perkins' dilapidated, freezing tenement building in the Lower East Side, a place far removed from the leafy tranquility of Central Park, yet inextricably linked to its nascent terror through the unfortunate wisdom of a man no one wanted to believe. Finch gave him the address, his eyes pleading, hollowed out by sleepless nights and the pressure of the press. "Just find it, Bones, before there's another headline that makes us look like damn fools, or worse, before we lose another soul to that thing." The pursuit, propelled by the cryptic fear of an old man, had begun, starting with the quiet man who knew the park's secret pathways better than anyone, even its architects. Bones crafted the plaster cast in silk, storing it in his worn briefcase, the cold plaster a constant, chilling reminder of the inhuman power they were now confronting in the heart of the modern world. The clock on his wall ticked past midnight, an unheeded warning that the creature's next hunt was likely already underway.
Bones found Wally Perkins in a squalid attic room that smelled heavily of stale, cheap tobacco, unwashed wool, and a potent, pervasive miasma of profound, debilitating fear. The single window offered a view of endless clotheslines and the grim rooftops of the neighboring buildings, a suffocating contrast to the open green space Perkins had devoted his life to tending. Perkins, a nervous, almost translucent man, whose hands constantly trembled and whose eyes darted around the room as if expecting the beast itself to materialize through the peeling wallpaper, refused to speak openly at first. He communicated only in short, terrified bursts and gestures. He pointed, instead, to a tattered, coffee-stained map of Central Park taped haphazardly to his wall, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. Perkins' finger, trembling violently, circled a specific, secluded, and ominously quiet area near the Shakespeare Garden and the Belvedere Castle, a densely populated area above ground, yet a place few tourists ever visited below, thick with impenetrable, overgrown foliage and the crumbling, forgotten foundations of various early park maintenance structures. "It's the well," Perkins finally rasped, his voice barely a discernible whisper catching in his throat like sandpaper. "The old maintenance well. They sealed it up after the '08 incident. A drowning the city hushed up, claiming it was poor construction. But it's more than a well, Bones. It breathes. It's an air vent, an artery to what lies beneath." He then revealed the true, complex motive for the beast's terrifying selective violence, an insight far more chilling than mere predatory hunger. Perkins confessed that he had been secretly feeding a small, semi-feral community of stray cats and raccoons near the well's hidden entrance for years, a small act of kindness in a cruel world. One particularly damp night, under a sliver of a crescent moon, he saw the beast emerge. It wasn't the small animals it pursued, it barely glanced at them. It seemed drawn by something else entirely, the faint, lingering scent of metal, specifically the residual iron and nickel carried on the people who passed nearby, perhaps even the electrical current from the few early gas-lit street lamps in that section of the park. He showed Bones a crudely drawn sketch he had made in a moment of feverish dread. A massive, vaguely simian creature, its dark, coarse fur slick with perpetual dampness, its immense hands delicately, almost reverently clutching a rusted, ornate metal locket, a locket he vehemently claimed that had belonged to a young, engaged woman who had mysteriously disappeared from that same exact area decades before, a case that had long since been relegated to the cold, forgotten files of the NYPD. Perkins' eyes, usually full of only fear, now held a glint of tragic certainty. He believed the beast was not a random killer, but a desperate, cursed entity guarding something vital within the earth, possibly the key to its own tormented existence, and that the victims were not prey, but simply collateral damage in its manic defense of its unseen territory and its precious hoard. Bones realized the beast's target wasn't the park's inhabitants themselves, but the artifacts and the elemental energies they unwittingly carried on their persons. This revelation immediately introduced a strong, undeniable supernatural angle, an elemental entity, a kind of primitive golem or bound earth spirit, perhaps, tied irrevocably to a specific object or a specific location. Bones needed immediate, covert access to the maintenance well, a feat requiring him to navigate the NYPD's official and politically motivated closure of the area. He needed a key, and Perkins, after much soothing reassurance and the sharing of a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey, produced a heavily corroded brass key he claimed to have stolen from a decommissioned park utility cart years ago, believing, in his fear, that it was the only thing standing between the civilized world and the subterranean terror. The park keeper's final chilling warning, delivered as Bones prepared to leave, solidified the urgency. When it's full moon, Bones, the iron in its blood sings, and that, detective, is when it hunts the hardest. Armed with the ancient, heavy brass key and a modified high-intensity gas lantern designed for deep-sea diving, which Bones preferred over modern electric torches for its steady, unwavering light that seemed to cut through both physical and metaphysical gloom, Bones navigated the dense thicket near the Shakespeare Garden. He found the camouflage entrance to the maintenance well exactly where Perkins had indicated. It was a heavy, circular plate of cast iron, cleverly disguised beneath a layer of soil and dead leaves. The brass key groaned and complained in the lock before finally turning with a rusty, ominous clunk. Bones lifted the heavy plate, revealing a narrow vertical shaft that descended into absolute, suffocating darkness. Before descending, he lit the lantern, its powerful, steady flame immediately seeming inadequate against the immense void. The air that rushed up to meet him immediately grew thick with a cold, metallic stench, not of ordinary decay, but of a strange synthetic compound of ozone, deep earth, and stale, wet iron. A smell Bones instantly recognized from his studies of alchemical summoning. The well shaft, lined with rough-hewn stone and dripping with cold condensation, opened after a precarious descent into a series of forgotten subterranean tunnels. These tunnels were not natural. They were clearly the remnants of an early abandoned water and sewage system for the city, forgotten during the 1900s upgrades. Bones followed the undeniable, muddy trail of large, three-toed footprints. The silence here was not merely quiet, it was absolute. A profound vacuum, heavier and more oppressive than the constant, distant thrumming of the city noise above. It was the silence of a tomb, or perhaps a cage. As he proceeded deeper, the tunnel walls transitioned from man-made brick to raw, unworked earth. Bones noticed strange, almost organized nests scattered in damp recesses. These were meticulously constructed mounds of tattered cloth, shredded newspapers, some dating back decades, and a truly disturbing collection of small bones from rodents and birds. Crucially, intermingled with this nesting material were pieces of human jewelry, a tarnished wedding band, a small, intricate porcelain brooch, and a child's rattle, objects saturated with human emotion and the presence of metallic components. This was the beast's hoard, its collection of trophies. Bones realized this was not a creature of instinct alone. It was a perverse, intelligent collector, a thing capable of profound, albeit twisted, sentiment. Finally, the main tunnel opened into a cavernous, low-ceilinged chamber. The central focus was a small, dark pool of stagnant water, fed by a slow, relentless drip from a fissure in the rock ceiling. Lying half submerged in the murky water, like a sunken treasure, was the heavily rusted, ornate metal box that Wally Perkins had described. It pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, with a latent energy. Bones recognized the alloy. It was a unique iron and copper blend, a known conductor for early occult binding rituals. As Bones took a cautious step closer, reaching for the box, the entire atmosphere changed drastically and violently. The slow, rhythmic dripping of the water from the ceiling abruptly stopped. The temperature in the chamber plummeted to an unnatural, bone-aching cold. A low, guttural, wet snarl, a sound that seemed to originate not from the throat, but from deep within the damp earth, echoed with terrifying proximity from the tunnel entrance behind him. The beast was home.
and it knew Bones had come for its most precious possession.
A creature that lunged from the thick shadows of the tunnel entrance was the embodiment of primeval terror. It was fully a foot taller than any man, covered in thick, matted black fur that seemed to absorb the light of Bones' lantern, making it a silhouette of pure aggression. Its limbs were disproportionately long, powerful, ending in claws that scraped and tore at the raw earth floor. Its eyes, exactly as Perkins had said, glowed with a faint, malevolent, internal red. They were not reflecting light, but generating it, like banked coals. This was beyond the scope of any natural predator. It was a manifestation of raw terrestrial malice. Bones, a man who had faced down poltergeists and conversed with the restless dead, did not panic. His training and his strange, extensive experience kicked in immediately. He wasn't armed with a conventional gun. Instead, he carried a small silver-etched vial containing what he called graveyard dust, a carefully prepared mixture of blessed salt, fine iron filings, and powdered quartz crystals, highly charged with latent electrical conductivity. As the beast lunged, closing the distance with terrifying speed and emitting a roar that shook dust from the ceiling, Bones did not hesitate. He shattered the glass vial on the cold, damp stone floor, then swiftly kicked the resulting cloud of dust directly into the path of the beast's charging face. The effect was immediate, spectacular, and agonizing. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, tearing sound, and recoiled violently, its massive hands flying to its eyes. The dust, being highly conductive, temporarily and painfully disrupted the invisible, humming, primal energy field that seemed to emanate from the beast's core, a shock to its elemental nervous system. In that precious, excruciating second of the creature's blindness and agony, Bones seized his opportunity. He lunged forward, snatching the rusted metal box from the edge of the pool where it had rested, the object feeling unnaturally cold and vibrating slightly in his gloved hand. He then retreated immediately, scrambling back up the narrow, precarious stone shaft of the well, the gas lantern swinging wildly and casting erratic, demonic shadows on the walls. He pulled the heavy metal door shut, just as the beast recovered its composure and slammed its immense, rage-fueled fist against the underside of the iron plate with a concussive, echoing bong that nearly blew out the lantern's flame. With trembling but resolved hands, Bones quickly turned the brass key, locking the beast back into its earthen cage. But the horror was not contained by the iron. The sound of the creature's frantic, frustrated scratching and roaring, a sound of pure, trapped fury, echoed sickeningly up the well shaft and across the seemingly serene park above, a chilling promise of future, inevitable violence. Bones knew the lock wouldn't hold a creature of this elemental power for long. He had at best a few hours. The race against time had just become a desperate sprint, with the metal box now clutched tightly under his arm, a silent, heavy, and potentially deadly burden. Back in the relative yet false safety of his subterranean office, the sounds of the city's frantic life seemed muffled and insignificant compared to the roar he had just heard. Bones placed the metal box carefully on a bed of velvet cloth, concerned about the volatile energy it seemed to emit. It was crafted from a unique, dark, non-ferrous alloy, a specialized iron and copper blend, resistant to the decades of dampness and subterranean pressure, a material designed specifically to contain something, not just store it. The lock mechanism was not typical. It was highly complex, featuring a series of unusual astrological and alchemical symbols arranged in an intricate geometric pattern, suggesting it required a specific, cyclical, non-numerical key or timing sequence. Bones immediately recognized the symbology, but needed an expert to confirm his unsettling suspicions. He called upon an old, slightly estranged associate, Professor Elijah Vance, age 57, a brilliant but disgraced occult historian from Columbia University, who now ran a dusty, obscure bookstore in Greenwich Village. Vance arrived, a man whose spectacles were perpetually fogged and whose tweed jacket always seemed to be covered in book dust, bringing with him an air of profound, forgotten knowledge. Vance immediately recognized the specific constellation of symbols. They belonged to a little-known, highly secretive, and deeply heretical pre-colonial American alchemical cult that had centered its esoteric rituals on the island of Manhattan long before the skyscrapers rose. Vance explained, his voice hushed with academic awe and professional alarm, that the cult's ultimate goal was the creation of a living golem, a formidable protector figure made of raw, untamed, elemental earth energy, controlled and given direction by an embedded human soul. The metal box, he definitively stated, was the anchor, the highly specialized ritual containment device intended to hold the beast's primal, untamed consciousness in check, preventing it from reverting to formless, chaotic energy. The lock, Vance determined by cross-referencing the symbols with an ancient almanac he had brought, was timed not to a clock, but to a precise, cyclical lunar phase. They quickly calculated the required alignment. The box would open exactly at midnight during the peak of the harvest moon, which Vance realized with a gasp of horror was tonight. They had mere hours. As the city's midnight chimes echoed faintly through the streets, the complex lock suddenly clicked and engaged, releasing a quiet metallic sigh. The box clicked open precisely on the final stroke, revealing not a spell or an elixir, but a single, exquisitely crafted ancient silver locket nestled on a bed of faded silk. The locket contained a fragile, faded daguerreotype of a beautiful young woman with piercing eyes, dressed in the elaborate fashion of the 1850s. The true, tragic purpose of the beast had just been revealed.
The discovery of the silver locket and the daguerreotype within the anchor box provided the absolutely essential missing piece of the terrifying puzzle. Working through the night, fueled by strong black coffee and a terrifying sense of urgency, Bones and Professor Vance threw themselves into intense archival research, utilizing Bones' extensive personal network of historical contacts across the city. Within hours, they identified the woman in the daguerreotype as Miss Genevieve Hawthorne, a prominent socialite and noted philanthropist who had mysteriously disappeared from Central Park in 1858, shortly before the park's official completion and grand opening. Genevieve had been engaged to a promising yet deeply obsessive and secretly disturbed young architect named Barnaby Thorne, age 32 in 1858, no known direct relation to the recent victims, but a chilling coincidence that did not escape Bones's notice, who had played a significant, albeit obscure, role in the park's original design and foundation work. Barnaby Thorne, Vance discovered, through obscure property records and coded journals, was a fanatic high-ranking member of the very alchemical cult they had identified. Obsessed with his fiancée and terrified that she would inevitably leave him for a richer, more fashionable rival, Barnaby had attempted a desperate, final, and blasphemous act. He had intended to use the golem he and his cult members had meticulously created, a towering, silent guardian of the park's sub-foundations, and bind Genevieve's loving, fiercely protective soul to the massive elemental creature, believing this would ensure she would forever remain and protect his greatest creation, the park itself. The ritual, however, failed in a truly spectacular, horrific, and unforeseen way. The golem, instead of receiving Genevieve's pure, loving, and guiding essence, was infused only with her immense immediate grief, her frantic rage, and her ultimate overwhelming confusion at the betrayal. This incomplete, broken soul infusion created the primal, deeply wounded, and devastatingly powerful beast that now terrorized the park, driven by a twisted, broken impulse to retrieve what it had lost. The silver locket, now cold and dull in Bones' hand, was the only physical link to Genevieve's original untainted humanity, and consequently the beast's single devastating weakness. Bones understood the horrifying truth. The beast wasn't hunting people out of simple hunger. It was desperately trying to reclaim its anchor and perhaps the pieces of its own tragically fractured soul. The very thing that had anchored it to the earth was now the key to its potential undoing or its total release. Bones knew that with the anchor and the locket removed from its lair, the beast's fragile control would break, making it more powerful and uncontrollably volatile than ever before. But he also knew that to end the cycle of violence and tragedy, he had to confront the beast's true, profound, and sorrowful nature. He had to be ready to end Genevieve's endless, tormented vigil.
With the locket secured in a silver-lined pouch, Bones made the urgent call to Captain Finch, explaining the beast's origins. An explanation Finch only half believed, though the urgency in Bones' voice was undeniable. Finch reluctantly agreed to provide a bare minimum perimeter for an hour before the city government's final catastrophic order for a full, violent, and undoubtedly public extermination would come down. Bones raced back to the park, heading not for the forgotten well, but for a new, specific location. He chose the iconic Bethesda Terrace and Fountain, a massive structure with ancient, interconnected water sources and a significant concentration of exposed iron in its magnificent original construction. It was fundamentally a perfect, massive focus point for an elemental creature bound to earth and metal. Bones positioned himself precisely in the center of the fountain's dry basin, a solitary, determined figure waiting in the vast, ominous space. He unwrapped the silver locket and placed it carefully on the cold stone before him. The atmosphere immediately grew thick, heavy, and intensely electric. The very ground beneath the terrace began to vibrate with a deep, low frequency that felt less like an earthquake and more like a massive, sleeping heart beginning to beat rapidly. Dust and small pebbles danced on the stone. The beast, drawn out of its lair by the sudden powerful energy shift caused by the opened anchor box and the exposed silver locket, the very essence of its binding, emerged not through the well, but by tearing a massive hole through the earth directly near the terrace's southern flank. It was no longer simply a territorial creature. It was a devastating, blind force of nature, howling with a maddening, wounded anger born of decades of loss and betrayal. Its black fur was bristling, and its size seemed to have increased tenfold, driven mad by the removal of its anchor. Bones did not retreat. He was armed not with force, but with knowledge. He held the silver locket aloft, its metal glinting faintly under the sparse moonlight. Then he began to chant a little-known counterbinding incantation given to him by Professor Vance, a ritual designed specifically to sever the original magical bond between the fragmented soul and the elemental golem body without completely destroying the soul itself. The incantation was a complex mixture of Latin and ancient earth languages, a soothing counterpoint to the beast's guttural rage. The beast charged, a terrifying, unstoppable locomotive of raw power, its red eyes burning like volcanic coals, focused solely on the glowing precious metal in Bones's hand.
The ultimate confrontation, though preceded by an hour of silent tension, was swift and profoundly tragic. As the beast lunged one final, desperate time, its massive clawed hands outstretched to reclaim its precious object, Bones stood firm. He waited until the last possible moment. Then, with a surprising burst of speed, he pressed the cold silver locket directly and firmly against the creature's immense, heaving, fur-covered chest. The effect was like a massive, instantaneous electrical short circuit running through tons of wet clay. The beast roared, a sound that was a complex fusion of extreme pain, profound shock, and, most heartbreakingly, a strange, agonizing, yet peaceful recognition. The malevolent red light in its terrifying eyes flickered rapidly, then dimmed and died, leaving only a dark, empty reflection. The immense, muscular, fur-covered body seized up completely, locked in a final spasm, then began immediately and rapidly to crumble. The elemental earth and stone that formed its physical manifestation began to disintegrate, returning rapidly to the soil from which it had been so violently and unnaturally drawn. Within agonizing moments, where the monstrous beast of Central Park had stood, there was only a large, steaming pile of dark, damp earth, and, miraculously, the faint, shimmering, transparent outline of a woman, Genevieve Hawthorne. She turned her translucent face toward Kane Bones, her ethereal expression one of profound gratitude, peace, and final relief, a silent farewell to her tormented existence. She nodded once, a gesture of thanks for her release, and then dissipated completely, like morning mist touched by the sun. The ancient, elemental threat was gone, its curse broken. Bones stood alone in the basin, retrieving the now cold and completely dull silver locket, placing it gently back into his pouch. Captain Finch arrived moments later, his men nervously securing the perimeter, their faces pale from the residual tension in the air.
They found no monster, only the massive pile of disturbed, steaming earth in the fountain basin, and a detective standing calmly amid the debris. Finch, a skeptic forever changed by the unseen realities he now had to acknowledge, simply nodded, a silent admission of the impossible truth. The official police report, meticulously crafted and politically sanitized, read, "A large rogue grizzly bear, having escaped transit from the western states, was tracked and regrettably eliminated in the deep woods adjacent to the park's northernmost border." The city went back to sleep, oblivious to the immense tragic reality and the elemental terror that had briefly reigned in its green heart. Kane Bones, the detective paranormal, simply added another unpublishable, truthful chapter to his silent chronicle of New York's supernatural darkness, the silver locket, now a cold, heavy weight in his pocket, a reminder of the price of unnatural love.